The New Enlightenment Project provides a series of educational interviews on the enduring qualities of reason and compassion which define humanism. This is the second of 2 sessions with historian, linguist, politician, and Metis-Cree elder Keith Goulet. In this session, we explore the traditional Cree family or clan system, the link between language and worldview, and implications of Aboriginal thought for humanism. Keith, I would like you to begin the second of this 2-part interview series with a picture taken during your 1991 swearing-in ceremony as the first Aboriginal cabinet minister in Saskatchewan. You are wearing a beaded jacket, and your father is standing behind you a little to one side. 6 of your siblings also attended your swearing-in. How fundamental was the support of your family in your career as a politician?
So that's what happened. And when we got in, when I ran, I got 82% of the vote, a massive number. And it was like that throughout the province, when we first got in. It's some people just call it a wave, sometimes there's a wave election and sometimes there's not. But, that's what happened at that time. So when it came back to our second, third, and fourth election, we won. We got through basically by a lot of politicking on the local grassroots level. But even so, some of the grassroots still, some of them had already changed their mind. So we were working with a smaller number, in the second, third, and fourth year. And most governments tend to be in that capacity. Some people get thrown out after the second term. The worst ones get thrown out after the first term. But some people will last third and fourth terms. And there's 2 reasons for it. One is a change that's taking place. The other one is the long-term political culture. But that can change too. People in Saskatchewan used to say, goodness gracious, the NDP never have a chance in Alberta. Boy, they're the most conservative people in Canada, those Albertans. Some people used to talk that way. But in reality, the NDP won the election over there. And in Saskatchewan, where we used to win it all the time, we lost. We got wiped out.
Okay, let's get back to the issue of language, because you brought that up and it's very important. In my first question, I confused Plains Cree with Swampy Cree from your home community. You've just finished a dictionary on a 3rd dialect, Bush Cree. Why is it important to maintain each of these dialects?
It's extremely important, basically because if you have the different dialects, you get to start understanding, that's how the history happened a long time ago. I'll give you a case. I was talking about an issue where a whole host of, in 1775, Peter Pond and many others had come in. They had about 150 people. They got to the paw. They were in the paw. They were stopped by a guy with 30 men. And they were asked to unload stuff. They didn't go through the proper pipe ceremony. They were asked to unload stuff. And sure they did. And they didn't go through the proper procedures on respecting in the usual indigenous cultures themselves, but they were a bit suspicious about the Europeans that were coming through. And sure, they should have. But it was interesting that during that period in time in 1775, you were in a situation where indigenous people felt that they had the control of the area and that the trade itself would reflect that. And that's what was happening.
Now, Tinigay is Bush Cree for thank you, but it's not a traditional word, is it? Where did that word come from, and how did it evolve?
I'm not 100% sure as to where the word Tinigay comes from. It could be, it's like in French, we have Marcy Chu is used with the dene. So there's a bit of borrowing that takes place. It could be thank you, a certain form of it. So there has been debate on that. But I did notice that we didn't use it in Cumberland. We didn't use Tinigay in Cumberland. We used Tapegitse, and we use a similar word with a Ron Stoke in an Ascomitan. But we didn't use the word Tinigay. And it's only when I went to university and later on that I started using the word Tinigay. And some people are even, if I see Cumberland people now going to the pub, and I mean to the Lawrence, they may happen to say Tinigay now, in due respect to how they speak it over there, because people borrow language and they tend to use it in the context that they're put in. So in your earlier question, I talked about the importance of different dialects and how that thing was. The guy that was in charge, and I'll finish the story. The guy that was in charge was called, in the books, they called him Pelican. And his name was Pelican. And I looked at the word that they used, but it was not the same word that we used in Cumberland. And the Cumberland word was quite different. Then I started asking the people around Cumberland territory. It was Sioux Lake, Red Earth, also in around Beaver Lake, Sturgeon Landing, and the Paw. And because we were using Sasagi, and they were using Tsatsagu or Tsatsagi. So I thought, how come it went from Tsatsago and Tsatsagi to Sasagi? Where did we find Sasagi? So my mind was thinking, and why is it that it's only Cumberland that's doing that in that region? So I phoned up Oxford House. I said, what's your word for pelican? They said Sasagi. And I said, oh yeah, that was, when people, smallpox would hit in 1781, 82, 1738, that people would move into Cumberland from different areas. And obviously the people from Oxford Earth who came in impacted us on the word Sasagi. And I immediately thought to myself, there must be some other words. So in time, I'll have to know a little bit more of the dialect in Oxford Earth to find out which ones are similar to us and which ones are different. So you get to learn a history. Then my mind is thinking, geez, did that happen in between 1815 and 1775, or did it happen in 1850s, 1840s, 1850s? So my mind goes like that. So the language dialects help you look at it. The other major one I looked at was, a lot of people said that the white dialect people from the south, the Metis-Cree, moved up to northern Saskatchewan. And they moved up to Alacross and Buffalo. But as soon as you look at the language, you realize, hey, it can't be. The people who are talking in Alacross and Buffalo Narrows speak the same dialect as the one in northeastern Alberta. And I found a word, for example, like we say, they play Emetawe chick, is how we say it. In the N dialect, Y dialect, TH dialect, we say that as well. But over there, they were saying Emetawe to. They have this Emetawe to, the to ending. And then I went to Alberta, they got the to ending. That's where it came from. So that's how you get to piece together your history. So the next question all the time is, when would it have occurred? And my theory is that I think it probably occurred in the 1781-82 period.
Okay.
Because they also reflect on our dialect over there, but I won't get into a conversation on that. So it's good to know the dialect. My position all the time is that the teachers come from a local area, so obviously they're going to be teaching their local dialect, but they should shift a little bit of their writing to reflect that local dialect. It doesn't make when people do that. I as a Cree reader, I read N dialect, TH dialect, and so on. It doesn't really, once you're about grade 4 and over, you are able to read the different dialects and make sense out of them.
Yeah. Now, of course, the European concept of thank you reflects a European use of conceptualization of gifting. And you've argued that what is often considered as Aboriginal gifting should be looked on as a kind of voluntary tribute. Can you explain that for me, please?
Okay. When I was doing one of the best books I read was a book by on indigenous people in the fur trade some time ago in the mid-70s. And it was a book by Arthur J. Ray. They call him Skip Ray, from BC. And he was writing on Indians in the fur trade. And he was talking about how indigenous people were impacting the fur trade culture. So he was talking about what is it that they impacted. And the word that he used was a word called Pagit-Naswin. Pagit-Naswin. Pagit-Naswin was an important word. And then I looked at the books in the 1700s. But that's where he got it from. He got it from Andrew Graham. And Andrew Graham had a meaning given to it in there. And the meaning was relatively close. But when I really examined it carefully, it was a little bit different from my own understanding growing up in Cumberland. I saw that they tended to use that as a word meaning gifting, gift giving, which was a strong aspect of indigenous peoples. And they said it was Pagit-Naswin, but then my thinking, how can that be? Megi ina are gifts. Megananwin is gift giving. That's what we use. So I said, well, I'll look at this word a little bit more carefully. What is the root word of Pagit-Naswin? Pagitin. Pagitin means to allow somebody to do something. Pagitin means that you give permission to someone, and therefore, in order for that to happen, an offering needs to be released, which is the Pagit-Naswin. And the Pagit-Naswin, therefore, is not gift giving. It's a tributary offering. When the people are meeting for the first time, particularly and very importantly, they needed to have a pipe ceremony. I'll talk about the pipe ceremony later on as a very important concept of the 4 directions, etc. But it did become an important part, on the latter part on the 4 directions ceremony, so that it is one where when I looked at these historical documents in the 1700s and looked at Cree language, I quickly recognized, some of the translations have been relatively good, in the historical document, but some of them were not. Some of them on Pagit-Naswin and Megi were mixed up. And in actuality, both were taking place. Tributary offering and gifting was taking place along with trade, the buying and selling. All those 3 aspects were taking place in the fur trade. And that's what caught my attention, overall. and so that's what I put in my dissertation.
Okay, so back historically, then, looking at things like the fur trade and Canadian history, I imagine that there could be some cross-cultural misunderstandings from this, because if one party is giving something and it's really a kind of tribute that establishes a relationship, perhaps a social contract of some kind, and the other is operating from a different European paradigm, then the meaning of the exchange is lost. Would that be correct?
Yeah, it's obviously it was lost in this case. And
Yeah.
I'm finding out different aspects. That's why I did the whole thing on land. I saw on my PhD, the debate on land was that, when the debate of concept of land was that. So what I add on is that the new perspective with Cree. Not to denigrate or look down upon what was there. Some of it is fairly close, some of it is partially correct, but you expand on your notion.
Okay. So one might give a gift to a traditional chief, an Ogimao, as establishing a relationship not just with an individual, but with the people that the chief represents. Would that be correct?
Yes, they could do that and the chief represents their group area because there's different leaders in the community. And whereas the Pagit Nazwin is more of the larger scale thing of the people.
Okay. Now for
But
the question.
The land itself and the control on the resources comes through the people.
Yeah. Now for the question everybody's been waiting for, I'm sure. What is the difference between an Ogimao and an Ogimagan?
Yes, Ogimao means, if you look at the 1700s information, it's fairly similar to what I grew up with. But it changed, when I went to university and I started seeing the big meetings that were taking place between First Nations people through at that time, the FSI, later on FSIN. And I also looked upon it with the Métis as well. When we looked at leadership in the community, when we looked at people who were leaders in the different realms, we called them Ogimao. Sometimes when we had people who were a little presumptuous and who were not really Ogimaos, but they were pretend Ogimaos, we would call them Ogimaga, so they pretend to be Ogimao, but they're really not. But the true title of Ogimao, therefore, somebody who attains that title in regards to the sharing of things, the working together with the people, and they start accumulating a following over a long period of time, and they become that. But Ogimagan, in Cree terms, is the difference between reality, the genuine reality, and the cultural created reality, the artificial reality, the artificially created reality. And Ogimao, the leader, then becomes Ogimagan. And that's the name that were given to the chiefs. And I was listening to the information in the 1960s onwards, and a lot of people still call the chiefs Ogimagan. But the Gan concept, I call it artificial substitution in Cree. The Gan concept itself, Ogimagan, the Gan concept is used in many cases. For example, we look at the real river, CP. And then we say CP Gan. It's an artificially created river. That's a dike, on the water that flows thereof, a ditch, etc., or a little river, a little that you create. And it's so the Gan concept is one of artificiality. When it's intersposed in terms of relationships, people, it carries the reality of the history of colonization and racism in the system. So you see that a lot of, I asked one of the elders when I was doing my research, my master's degree in 1976, I asked one of the elders in Sandy, I said, where did this idea come from, this GAN concept? Because we were seeing that in different words in the community. He said it came from Indian affairs. It came from those people that were trying to control us. You know, from real leaders, we had become leaders that are under the control of Indian affairs. And he said that's where he said it come from. I tend to agree with him, you know, from the 1880s periods onwards, but some of it must have happened with the fur trade as well. I think that there were some leaders that would have tended, you know, to side with the government or the traders and with their people. They still work with their people, but the benefits thereof accrued more individualistically, you know, rather than with the community. And so it must have already started before. So I did agree with the elder about the impact of governance and government, you know, on Indian affairs. But I think the aspect of artificial substitution of how to put down people is not only reflected in that, it's reflected in other social relations overall.
Well, that is an example about how we can learn from language, and are the elected chiefs then, are they Ogima or are they Ogimagan?
Yeah, most of the time when I go in and go in, I tend to use the word Ogimao, you know, to represent them, you know, from my personal knowledge of what has happened. And some people still use Ogimao to mean Ogimagan, which more or less means the genuine chief, which is true as well in terms of when you look only at meaning. But when you look at a closer examination of the structure from Ogimao to Ogimagan, you say to yourself, well, what does Ogimagan mean? Well, they're not really true chiefs. You know, a lot of people will say that, and because they're being controlled by the system of the outside, and it's an important distinction, and it'll continue. But I see some people are starting to use Ogimao now, and I've seen it particularly in the last 5 years. I'm seeing a lot more people using Ogimao now for their own people.
Now, you've already touched on grammatical gender, and gender in most Aboriginal languages in North America, or at least the Canadian portion of North America, are not male and female, but between animate and inanimate. And could you expand a little on how that affects, what implications that has for philosophy and worldview?
It's a fairly massive, complex system, the animate and inanimate system. In English, you know, the grammatical structure, for example, first person, second person, third person. In Cree, we have first person, second person. There's 2 third persons, there's 2 first person plural, and there's 2 third person plural as well. So there are differences in the Cree structure, even just on that grammatical, you know, gender idea. And the aspect of the animate system, I did a paper about 20 years ago, and I had it published in Scotland, you know, in one of their journals. And I talked about at least 9 different aspects of what makes animate to inanimate. A lot of the linguistics viewpoint was quite a big generalization. They said it was living for animate, non-living for inanimate. So everybody has said that all through the time since we've been teaching Cree in the early 70s. You know, I taught Cree at university by 1972. And so people have been saying that. And but in actual fact, the division is not only on living and non-living. The division is on the whole and parts of the whole. The whole tend to be animated. Parts of the whole tend to be inanimate. But there are always little exceptions. For example, this hand is pretty much alive. But in Cree, I will say michi tiuma, inanimate. It's stated in the inanimate form.
Also going the other direction, stones, asini, is animate.
Yeah, stoves are animate, but only in, now I found out in Cumberland, but they're inanimate in Laurent.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. So it's one of them. There's always exceptions on certain things when you're analyzing grammatical systems. But I found that for myself when when we were teaching, and I said, oh, okay. So you have to teach that way. You will say "Kutana pis awa," is what we say, and they would say "Kutana pis kuma." So it is. So you have to learn, those slight variations, that are around. But in general, the major system is there for all the dialects. So you have that system of let's say on the living aspect for my hands, but all the aspect is Tigano. This is my head. The majority of the things that are, but there is a couple of things that are made animate in Cree, and that's breast for one, and also in regards to the private parts of a man or a woman. The private parts of a woman are animate, and the private part of the man is inanimate. A lot of people used to laugh about that.
That could have implications for philosophy and worldview, I suppose.
Yes.
Leading on that, the term two-spirited has come to represent a sexual gender in a growing pantheon of woke genders. How was the term two-spirited used traditionally?
I was asked by a few two-spirited women, people about that, but I couldn't, it wasn't a common everyday term, that people had. It would happen obviously from time to time, but it wasn't part of my vocabulary. So people are trying to figure out, the proper naming and respectful naming for it right now. And some of the people, but I've seen some examples of that. And but just because it wasn't there wasn't there in words doesn't mean it didn't happen before. Of course it did.
Humanism involves, as you know, rejecting supernatural explanations in favor of scientific and rational understandings. It respects the notion of, it rejects rather the notion of revealed truth in favor of discovered truth, with the provision that what is true is never completely known and may be modified with evidence. This worldview is sometimes thought of as European because the Enlightenment occurred first in Europe. Is there or can there be such a thing as aboriginal humanism? And if so, what would it look like?
The Aboriginal humanism that is there is interesting in a sense that obviously there's life wood all over the place. But does that mean we don't recognize people? Obviously, there is word such as Innu or Innu, meaning people. And when I look at the word Inini Siu, meaning the person or the people, Inini Siu means a self-determining being. It's a self-determining being, and that's the one aspect that I saw in the peoplehood argument or the humanism argument. That was an important part of Cree thinking. It also became to be embedded in our concept of nation. if I talk about the people, for example, the Cree from the Poa Manitoba, I will say Upaskiai Inniak. Inniak is used, meaning the people of the Paw or the nation of the Paw. And that's how it is used in the Cree language. So just because I said that there's a greater extensive view on lifehood doesn't mean that peoplehood and people are not part of the ideology. And of course, the debates, in much the same way that the debates on humanism have been evolving and developing in different strands, through history. So the debates on humanism in Cree, from that perspective, will evolve as well, on the concept of nationhood, people, etc. But the concept of humanism, which have been around for a while, but a more naturalistic philosophy has been an interpretation, of others, and a more science-based, approach, by others, and others have talked about it in different ways. But I've looked at it in non-literal interpretations on certain things that I will talk about when I talk about the Four Directions ceremony.
You have been part of a political and also social movement for all of your life. And we've traced some aspects of your life in this interview. As you reflect back, what are some of the accomplishments, not just that you have made, but what we all have made as part of a movement, and where are we going from here? What needs to be done?
My thinking was when we were around, and I was coming into the system about the 1960s, and we were seeing, big debates, the 69 white paper, all of that was happening. And we were trying to figure out where do we go. And of course, there was many strands on the theory on what needed to be done in economic development and jobs, in social development and in cultural development and in the psychological dimensions of people. And we talked about that quite a bit during that period in time. And we recognized that we had to do work. We weren't able to do work in all of those areas. So it's interesting that most of the development that occurred moved in the direction of education. When I went to university, there's only 5 of us that I knew of that were at the university, 5 Indigenous people. And nowadays in Saskatchewan alone, I think there's about 4,000. So you're seeing not only the education of Indigenous people, it also went into the idea of the indigenization of the educational structure, where you have First Nations University. You do have, even in Northern Saskatchewan, you have a Northern Teacher Education Program, that dealt with Indigenous peoples. And you had as well as the Métis Nation institutions. So you're seeing not only an individual level of development on education, but the institutionalization of Indigenous people in the various realms. We saw it in the political realm. It's always very interesting for me in the 1950s when people were doing the political development, for example. Most of the Indigenous people that were there, some of them were still very strong on their Indigenous beliefs, but most of them were Christianized. So there are a lot of Christian, 90% of the people were in that bracket, even more so. But when you looked at how they organized and what they did in ceremonies, rather than start with the Lord's Prayer, they had a pipe ceremony. And they had their own prayers. Even though they had been Christianized, there was a strong dimension of people, that even though they were in that level. And I remember it was debated a bit, not quite out into the open, but it was debated. That's what they would do, and that's what people did. So you're seeing that aspect continue, because in many cases, in right up to the 1950s, a lot of the ceremonies were illegal in Canada, in Canadian law. And it's only more recently, that they've been accepted, Sundance and others. And, although it's been there, it's been slow. I first went to a powwow, I think, in the late 1968, something like that. And, later on, you saw it evolve and develop. And it's quite a big thing now. So you're seeing that evolution and development on cultural development as well. You're seeing an attempt at a regaining of the culture in the educational institution, as a major thing. They still have a long ways to go on that, but it has happened. A lot of the basics are already there, and they're moving forward. And the next big thing that we tried, and I became a cabinet minister, we tried to get economic development when I was a minister going. We had about $20 million worth of contracts in the mines in northern Saskatchewan, and we had a catchment area of about 35,000 people, of which 75% were indigenous. And we focused in on indigenous employment and indigenous business development. We went from, when I was a cabinet minister, 20 million worth of contracts to $250 million worth of contracts in about a 3-year period. And it's remained there and even more in certain years, depending on the economic development. There's ups and downs on it all the time. But it's one where people said, basically the underlying theme was this: indigenous self-determination is not going to occur unless there is a strong indigenous economic self-determinative effort. You need economic development to create a lot of strong developments on indigenous peoples in history. So we did that, and now you're seeing the new developments. I think there's going to be work to be done in the health field. Large scales of money all over the Americas and everywhere are spent on health. But we haven't made a big dent, on the number of nurses and doctors we need, and etc. So we need to do a lot of development on that. There were some provinces, Manitoba had, a development on that for a period of time. I don't know where it's at now, but it was good. And so we need to do it in all the provinces. But sometimes some provinces are slower than other provinces. It's the differences in Canada. And so that's another aspect that I see development is the health field. The sense of well-being, and at the same time that we're talking about indigenizing the culture of the health system, people are talking also about mental health. Laurence Matt, for example, now a mental health institution, dealing with people in that situation. So you're seeing that move along. So I think the future is going to have to continue to emphasize economic development and education. I mean, they will form the basics, and also health. Health will move along, and within the next 10, 15 years, I think it'll be in a stronger position. And I think the other things on cultural and social development, I think it'll help all of those, because some of the people are getting better training in those areas as well, in the indigenous institutions, and even the non-indigenous institutions are also moving in that direction.
Well, I want to thank you. We've gone a little bit over time, but that's okay. I want to thank you, Keith, for this. I'm tempted to commend you on a life well lived, but your life is not over, and I'm looking forward to reading your next book. And I'm not sure what you personally will have planned after that, but I do know that you're part of a marvelous family, and that you're a respected elder in that family. And so yes, it's a life well lived. Thank you. And thank you for this interview.
Well, thank you very much, John.
The New Enlightenment Project provides a series of educational interviews on the enduring qualities of reason and compassion which define humanism. This is the second of 2 sessions with historian, linguist, politician, and Metis-Cree elder Keith Goulet. In this session, we explore the traditional Cree family or clan system, the link between language and worldview, and implications of Aboriginal thought for humanism. The New Enlightenment Project is committed to increasing civil discussion of difficult and controversial topics. We hope you have enjoyed this 2-part conversation with author, linguist, politician, and Metis-Cree elder Keith Goulet. Visit our website at nep-humanism.ca, where you can watch more interviews in this series, participate in our blog, become a member, or make a donation. We are also on Facebook. You can subscribe to our podcasts and webinars at YouTube at nep-humanism.